Thank you, the futurist Shinji, for inviting me to share some of my knowledge in terms of macroeconomics. Initially, we wanted just to put macroeconomics, and Shinji said, no one will come, so we have to put Bitcoin there so that everybody gets excited about it and joins in. This is my own personal education slides. It's nothing to do with my company. Anything I mention here, it's not financial advice. Economics, economics is something which I did very badly in school. It's one of my worst subjects in A levels and also in university. But they say, God has his way of sometimes punishing you, and at the end of the day, I became an economist. The economics is extremely dry. I remember back then, simple things like what is GDP, ends up like, there's a definition to it. It's like, oh my God, GDP is what? Market value, final goods, country borders, specific period, and then you found out that market value means that, when you calculate GDP, you just cannot take units. You must take units and times all the price, and then you get the total value here. That's really market value. You can't talk about final, you need to talk about final goods. You just can't talk about the coconut. You need to talk about when the coconut changed into coconut water and was sold as coconut water. That's really how it goes into GDP, not the intermediate goods. And then it needed to be domestically, anything that's domestic, not foreign, in terms of outside of the country and for a particular period. So this is really what put everybody to sleep, and this is really why I got D for econs in most of my econ subjects. It was very, very dry. I want to just tell you, don't worry. Tonight, I'm not here to give you all these things. I'm going to try my very, very best to make it as fruitful to you. It will be very basic. It will be an introduction kind of level. If you don't have any basic economic background, I think you will understand maybe half or 2/3 of it. Some of them are slightly technical. What I hope that you come out from this workshop, 1 hour workshop, is to have basically an appreciation of macroeconomic data and some of the analysis that goes behind it, to understand that it's actually not frightening, but it can be a bit complicated if you want to go in more in depth. In depth. So I hope to get you excited about it. And I hope this is a starting point where you actually come to understand, appreciate, and if you want to go on further, approach me, ask me, go to YouTube. Nowadays the information is just so vast that if you really wanted to learn about one particular subject, it's just an overflow of information. But if you need some guidance, always come to me. So these are the stuff that we're going to go through. I won't mention here what these things are. I think you just have a quick look at it, and these are really some of the stuff that we will be going through one by one over the next 1 hour, and I will leave the additional half an hour maybe for Q&A. Okay. Let's start off with what's macroeconomics. Okay. So really, in the tweet that was sent out, I think this really captures what macroeconomics is. First of all, there are two major classes of economics. The microeconomics really talks about individuals. The macroeconomics really talks about the bigger picture. So if I would just put it in pictures, the top picture itself is the micro, because of all the individuals, whether it's an individual, whether it's a firm, the interaction, the demand and supply within that these individuals. How do corporations, how do businesses determine equilibrium level? How do individuals determine equilibrium level, demand and supply? That's really micro, and macro really is talking about the country itself on a very big level, the helicopter view of all the micro stuff. So when you talk about macro, a lot of times you hear the word aggregate. When you talk about micro, you don't really hear the word aggregate, because you talk about like individual firms, individual people, households and such. When you talk about macro, aggregate means the combination of all the individuals, the combination of all the firms, because we're really talking about a very high level, the economy itself. Okay, so that's really just a very basic way of looking what's the differentiation when people talk about microeconomics and macroeconomics. So macro is very high level. It encompasses all the individual players that you find under the micro side. Macroeconomic data, when we have a country, when we have an economy, you'll find that the economy has data, sales levels. You'll find that basically growth levels. You'll find that basically, they have price levels and such. So data is being churned out as an economy actually moves along, chugs along, over a period of time. And therefore, you will see headlines like this. Basically, U.S. economy headed for recession. You find words like GDP, UK inflation. The numbers here. You got manufacturing. You got unemployment. So these are all macroeconomic indicators that actually come out from the economy. And these are data that's available. And the statistic department, sometimes Bank Negara, sometimes the central bank, sometimes even the Security Commission will track volumes on the financial markets and such. So all these are data. So what really is the use of all this data? The use of all this data is basically as a health check. Because again, as a policymaker, let's say you're the government, you really want to put your finger on the pulse of the economy, and you want to know where the economy is, how the economy is doing within the business cycle. Is it feeling sick? Are we in a recession? Are there indicators to show that we're in a recession? Are we going too fast? Is it become inflationary because we're just running at too fast a speed and such? So the macroeconomic data basically gives you an idea, gives the policymakers especially an idea of how well the economy is doing and whether there needs to be intervention, maybe on the monetary side by the central bank, maybe on the government side via fiscal policy and such. Okay, so it's really a health check, telling the policymakers how the economy is doing. You'll find that there are many ways to represent data, and I just want to give you kind of brief two examples of how data is represented and why data is represented in such a manner. Okay, you'll find that many data are, first of all, they sometimes are very clean, straightforward, plain vanilla. CPI is this, CPI is that, GDP is this, GDP is that. Okay, but when it comes to comparing one country to another country, sometimes, one state to another state, and so on and so forth, you'll find that sometimes data is being used in terms of a ratio. Okay, and I'll just give you an example: per capita GDP. So GDP per capita, GDP per person. Okay, why is there a need to do so? Because sometimes when we do comparison as an economist, data, let's say for example, GDP, the size of the GDP in country A is this. Okay, and this is 10 billion. Okay, and the size of country B, and these are just fictitious numbers. Country B, the size of the GDP is 1 billion. If you just base it on the size of GDP, straight away you say that country A is larger than country B. Country A is richer than country B because GDP is a reflection of a country's output. It can be seen as the wealth of a country. Okay, so it's the country A is wealthier than country B, but you can't really say so from a one dimension. You really need to bring in a second dimension, which is population. Because, country A may have 10 million population. Country B may only have 100,000 people within it. So it's a small little island, but it produces a GDP of that particular number. Because what happens then is when you divide GDP over population, you'll find that each population in country A produces 1,000 GDP. Each population in country B produces 10,000 GDP. So now it tells you a different story. Now it tells you that actually, despite the fact that country B's GDP is lower than country A GDP, country B actually it's a much wealthier country because its individual population, individual citizens, each and every one of them, actually the output level is $10,000. Their wealth is 10,000, for example, compared to country B. Contrary to country A. Okay, so this is a much better indication. This is a much better measurement compared to just saying, A has larger. So you'll find in macroeconomics, sometimes they slice and dice data in order to make it more comparable, in order to make it a better reflection of the overall situation rather than just one dimension. Okay. Below here, you see just now earlier on, one of the headlines showed 9.1%. Okay. So by and large, when you see numbers like this, these numbers are typically year over